The lecture discussed this concept of the self. How is that different from personality? They seem so intertwined.
They are very much intertwined. But you can think of the self as more of that internal experience, subjective, how we see ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, how much we value ourselves. Personality definitely influences all those things. But the self is that bigger picture.
If personality is how we interact with the world, the self is how we process all those interactions and understand our place in everything.
You got it. And the lecture even goes a little deeper, bringing up this guy, William James, a really important psychologist. He made this fascinating distinction between what he called the I and the me.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. It's like when you catch your reflection in the mirror and there's that split second where it's, that's me, but also me is over here looking at it.
Such a good way to think about it. It gets at that difference between the one doing the observing and the thing being observed. The I is that pure awareness, the feeling of just existing and going through life. Whereas the me is the object of all that self-reflection, the story we tell about who we are.
So the me is almost like this character we develop based on everything we go through and how we interpret it all.
Exactly. And the lecture goes on to break down the self-concept even further into different parts. One of them we've talked about a little already, self-esteem.
Which boils down to how much we like or dislike ourselves,
Yeah.
right? Although it seems like a lot of that comes from outside factors, like how other people see us, our achievements, even social media these days.
You're hitting on something really important there. The lecture talks about how William James saw self-esteem as this balance between our aspirations and our actual accomplishments, that gap between the person we want to be and who we think we are. But he goes on to say that so much of it comes from early experiences, especially early on with love and feeling like we belong. All that shapes our self-esteem.
It's like we build up this sense of worth based on those early relationships and carry that with us throughout our lives.
And then that sense of worth is constantly being measured and remeasured against everyone else in our social world. We compare ourselves to other people, we look for validation, connection. It all feeds into how we see ourselves.
Which makes me think about how attached we can get to our stuff. Almost like our possessions become part of us. The lecture calls it the material self, right? It's like that old saying, you are what you own, but taken to a whole other level.
Absolutely. It uses the example of how someone might feel personally violated if their car gets a scratch. It's not really about the car itself, it's about what that car represents to their sense of self.
And then there's the flip side of that, where we use possessions to project a certain image of ourselves, even if it's not totally true to who we are. Like buying a fancy car to feel more adventurous, when really your biggest adventure is trying a new restaurant.
It's so true. The lecture calls it symbolic self-completion, this idea that we use material things to try and bridge that gap between who we actually are and who we wish we were.
It makes you wonder how much social media plays into all of this, too. We're always curating these online versions of ourselves through what we choose to post, even what we choose not to post.
Such a good question. And it ties into this whole other idea of the social self, which is basically the idea that we present different versions of ourselves depending on the situation the people we're with. Remember, the self isn't fixed. It's constantly changing and adapting.
It's like they say, I'm not a different person with you, I'm just a different part of myself. We make adjustments based on who we're with, where we are.
The lecture gives an example of a young boy who acts one way with his friends, another way around his parents, and then a whole other way in a more formal setting. Each situation calls for a different version of himself, and that shapes how he sees himself in those different contexts.
And it's not even always a conscious choice, is it? We pick up on these social cues, we adapt, and after a while, those different sides of ourselves just become second nature.
The lecture refers to it as the looking glass self, this idea that we're always using other people's reactions as a mirror to understand ourselves. It explains why social feedback, good or bad, is so powerful. It has this way of shaping our self-perception, often without us even noticing it.
Wow, that's actually mind-blowing when you really think about it. We can try to control how other people see us, but we're also being shaped by their perceptions, whether we realize it or not.
It really is this strange paradox. Makes you wonder how much of who we are is guided by our own internal compass and how much is influenced by this back and forth of social interaction.
It's a lot to process. And speaking of processing complex ideas, the lecture also talks about this idea of the spiritual self, which seems like a really personal and nuanced aspect of the self.
It is. The lecture talks about it as that core part of who we are, not necessarily connected to religion, but more about our values, our purpose, those deeper truths that resonate with us deep down.
It's like that inner voice, that gut feeling that guides us even when it doesn't make sense logically.
Exactly. And it's interesting because even though psychologists have come up with all these ways to measure personality and even different aspects of the self, this idea of a spiritual self, it's much harder to pin down. It's not easily categorized.
I guess that makes sense, though. How do you measure something so personal and intangible? It'd be like trying to capture the feeling of a dream.
Exactly. But the lecture emphasizes that it's precisely that elusiveness that makes the spiritual self so important to our sense of identity.
It's like this mystery at the heart of who we are, this feeling that there's something more. And that drives us to look for meaning, for connection, to figure out what it all means. It's that drive, that searching, that really gets at the heart of who we are. And speaking of getting to the heart of who we are, the lecture then gets into this whole idea of the true self and this whole quest for authenticity. So is this true self something we're born with? Do we discover it somewhere along the way, or do we actually create it through the choices we make?
Yeah, it's a question that's been around forever. Philosophers have been going back and forth on this for centuries, and there's no easy answer. The lecture seems to suggest it's both this interplay between finding our true selves and actively creating them. Like we might be predisposed to certain things, but those tendencies get molded by what we experience in life, the choices we make, all of that plays a part.
So it's not necessarily about finding this perfect, fully formed, true self hiding inside us somewhere, but more about actively shaping and cultivating it over time.
Yeah, exactly. And the lecture points out how different people approach this in such different ways. Like some people, they crave those intense experiences, right? Traveling, maybe throwing themselves into a demanding career, just pushing boundaries to figure out who they are. And then others, they find it through quieter reflection, meaningful relationships, a deep commitment to their values. There are so many paths.
There's no one right way to find that authenticity. It's about what clicks with you, what lines up with your values, even if those things evolve over time.
Exactly. And it reminds us that the journey itself, it matters just as much as wherever we think we're going. It's in those moments of exploring, testing our limits, trying new things, that we often learn the most about who we are, what truly matters to us.
It's like that quote, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." It's when we face our fears and we venture into the unknown, that's often where we find the most meaningful parts of our lives.
And that's something for you listening out there to think about. What chapters are you writing in your own story right now? What challenges are you stepping up to?
Wow, that's an amazing question to end on.
Exploring these ideas, it doesn't have to be stuffy or academic. It can be fun, it can be insightful, even engaging.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ourselves. Until next time.